Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're enjoying lunch. I thought we would get started with our program so we can finish up on time. We've got a lot of really interesting information. For some of you who I've not met, I'm Greg Kushner, the founder of Lido Consulting and our sister company, Lido Advisors. We've been putting on events like this for about 23 years. I started when I was 5. Nobody believed that. But I see a lot of regulars and a lot of new faces. So obviously this is a very interesting topic. We've got a very full house today. So people are interested in cannabis. There's no samples today, sorry. Somebody thought there was no. But I'd like to introduce, we're going to do a little different thing. We're going to have a presentation and then a panel. So I'm going to have Rob come up and kind of give us an overview. He's with Dolores Equity on the cannabis real estate lending, and then what he's been able to do, and I looked at, and you have it on your materials, he's put together a panel of some really amazing experts in the field of investing related to the cannabis field. So why don't we give Rob a very warm welcome. Thank him for hosting our lunch today.
Well, thanks for all coming and joining us today for our, our real estate lending educational seminar here to kind of answer questions and tell you how we underwrite transactions and the way we look at things. Before we start, I just wanted to see, is there, in case the camera pans towards the crowd, is there anybody that doesn't want to be on camera? There's no close-ups or anything, but just want to make sure there's no issues there. Okay, sounds like there's no issues. So today we're going to just talk a little bit about what Dolores does and how we look at things, and then we're going to have our panel come up here, and I'm going to try to get through my talking points fairly quickly, and I want to have as much time available for questions and answers with the panel. So let's go to the next one here. So obviously, I have to go through our disclosures. We didn't have it in there, but Leo requires it, and I guess it's always prudent that everything in here is for educational purposes and not facts, and everybody needs to talk to their own lawyer before they take any advice, blah, blah, blah. So anything's subject to change at any time. All right. So I just want to tell you who we have as our panelists here, and we'll get into it a little bit more. We've got Dennis Baranowski, who is our Rossi Law Firm. It is our transactional attorney for our transactions, and I think we've done more than $165 million worth of transactions with them, more than 265 total transactions. They created those documents, and we repurposed those, and we've got securities offerings that we use with them. So lots of transactions have gone through with those guys, and we've been working with Anthony Grassi, the owner of it, since I think for more than a decade before he even formed Grassi Law Firm. So we've also got Sid Warburton here, who is our cannabis appraiser, and he specializes in commercial properties and high-end commercial transactions, and has been an expert in that field, and we'll be able to talk about valuations there. We also have Peter Whittingham, who is our public affairs advisor, and Peter has been specializing in looking at zoning and licensing, or not licensing, but permitting, entitlement for properties, and he's worked with one of our, with Rick, our managing director here for many years on several projects when Rick was at another family office before we were able to bring him over to Dolores. And we also have the senior underwriter from OC Title, who's Dave Schumacher, who we're really grateful to have here, because whether you know it or not, title insurance effectively doesn't exist anymore for any cannabis-related transactions. So if you know that your transaction is going to be cannabis-related and you didn't disclose it, and you have a claim, you might have some issues there. And OC Title is the only one that we know of that's out there that's doing it. It's a well-known company. There may be some small boutiques, but that's who we're working with, and they seem to be ahead of the curve on that. So we'll bring them up after I go through just a couple of things. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about who Dolores Equity Group is, why we stay in the medically licensed transactions, just a brief summary of some of our underwriting process, then we'll have our discussion with the panelists, and try to open that up for some Q&A. We're hoping to have a political update as well. And I don't see Jason here. Jason Pitkin's not here, right? Okay, hopefully he'll be here by 1. But if not, we're potentially expecting a call from Congressman Dana Rohrabacher today as well to get an update. And then we have some case studies, but honestly, I think that the Q&A is probably going to be more informative with the panel that we've assembled. So the reason that Polaris is going into medically licensed transactions is because that's what the safest harbor there is right now. And the reason that that's a safe harbor is that Congressman Dana Rohrabacher did the Rohrabacher-Farr amendment many years ago. And what that amendment was is it defunded the Department of Justice from being able to prosecute any medically medicinal cannabis-related business in a state that had approved it. So even though it's federally illegal, Dana Rohrabacher defunded it. That amendment is a standalone amendment. It's now changed to the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment because Farr retired. And there are some more things that are happening with that amendment. I'll just touch on it briefly. That amendment is being geared up to go into what's called the Omnibus Spending Bill. And once it's in the Omnibus Spending Bill, it will not be a standalone amendment. Every time that the budget is passed every year, it's part of that whole budget. So we'll get an update from Dana hopefully on that and what's happening there and some other stuff too. The other reason that we're doing the medically licensed and staying in that is there's less stigma associated with the medical licenses. You know, everybody has their own takes on recreational drugs, and we prefer to stay as under the radar as possible. We're not here to promote anything, and even Dan, our CEO and president, he's even got some personal stories to share from some of his families that have got some success with some of the oils and things like that. You know, we're just looking at this for a lending perspective, and you know, we're starting to hear these stories that are actually, you know, touching people that we know. So the other thing is that there's less exposure to the medical license operators. We feel that the Department of Justice and the feds and the DEA are going to be less targeting for medicinal purpose operations than they will for a recreational dispensary that's, you know, right on the main boulevard. So that's kind of why we're in that space and going in medical license. One of the things that I didn't touch on is Polaris ourselves. Just a little bit of background on Polaris is that we formed Polaris in 2008. Since that time, we've done 165 million in transactions. That's more than 265 individual transactions. And the bulk of that was residential, value add, and construction transactions. We have done commercial transactions as well, but that's where the highest yield was. Prior to 2008, our CEO, Dan, has had an extensive career. He's been in the business for almost 3 decades and done over 4,500 transactions in his career. And that experience of doing that many transactions is why you want to go with a company like Polaris. We've pretty much seen and dealt with every scenario, and that saves you money and protects you know, your investment. When we've had those experiences with them, we're already protecting either with provisions in our loan documents or strategies that we're employing to avoid issues with borrowers or whatever that might be. And when you need it, it's important to have that stuff. Okay. So for us, our underwriting process, I'm just going to briefly touch on it because it's kind of personal to every lender out there. But we've developed our underwriting processes through best practices for years and years and years of all the transactions that we've done. And even when it switches from a residential transaction to commercial transaction, the core of the underwriting process is still the same. We're still looking at the core elements. There may be sub-elements that we go into deeper, like the cannabis operator, the licensing, and things like that. But we've developed those best practices. We have lists that we go through. We amend those lists. Each transaction has its own list that gets subdivided and has more things that we add to it as we find new things. Does this transaction need different title endorsements on it because of the property it is or whatever that might be? So from all those transactions, our investors are getting the benefit of all the transactions that we've done, that list being continually repurposed and added to over time. So some of the not necessarily do we do the things in this order, but we may start with verifying the cannabis-related business licensing, zoning, the conditional use permits by our expert public affairs advisor. So that we want to make sure that those licenses are, what type of license does this property have, or what type of licenses can this particular property have? Is it going to be a conditional use permit? Is it going to be a state, is it going to be a city permit, a county permit? What is it? So we get a report from Peter, and that goes into our file and part of our underwriting process. That process, that due diligence of that, we're going to provide that information to Sid, our appraiser, and we're going to go and when we do our valuation check, we may not only be providing him information about the property, previous appraisals, previous information that we may have, just so he has an idea of what he's getting into, but we're also going to provide him potentially a budget for what the property, what they're going to do with the property, any improvements, and that is going to be factored into, if it's a completed value or future value loan, that'll all be factored into the value. So we're providing that to Sid. Sid's doing his own review of the permits and things like that himself to the extent that he can and what his requirements are. But all that gets blended into the appraisal as well. And in those appraisals, we also have the ability to do it with not only the cannabis lease rates, but non-cannabis. And in our valuation process, we'll get both of those values. So we know what are the limits, what's the range of where the rents can end up on this property if something drastic was to happen. And what I mean drastic is what if they double the amount of permits in that city now, and there's twice as many permits that can be issued, so now the values deflate or something like that, or the city next door decides that they're going to go cannabis back, they're going to be cannabis back. We also do extensive background check on the sponsors and the operators, and that's done by the Garasi Law Firm, and there's different levels of background checks that we can go to, and more importantly, if we see anything that's concerning whatsoever, we just walk from the deal. We've never had that. All the operators and sponsors of the transactions have been beyond, we never realized this when we went into the business, but they've been CEOs, doctors, lawyers, they've been very sophisticated people that are putting these groups together to raise the money and to develop these businesses. So that was something that we didn't expect and we didn't know. So, but we still have those best practices in there to make sure that nobody comes in along the line. Not only do we do it on the front side, but we do it every 6 months, and we also do it in the event that there's any change of ownership of the entity or of a tenant, if there is a new operator that came in. So we're continually making sure that we have that. That's the one area that we have exposure, or potential exposure, if the Fed, if we have a bad actor, so we want to weed that out proactively ahead of time. We also want to review the operator's cannabis experience. It doesn't do us any good to have a great loan and a great property, but the operator doesn't have the experience to make money at it. We'd rather just not do the deal. Yes, we could replace that operator, but that's not the business that we're in. We don't own the property, so we'd rather make sure that we're putting, that property's got a way of being able to cash flow the payment and take care of us, take care of making our payments to our investors. I already touched on ordering the appraisals with our guidelines, and the last thing I'll talk about is the title policies. And so, as new guys or new lenders are going into this space, they're going to start finding their different title, trying to work with title, trying to work with OC title, and we're getting the ALTA policy, which is what we should always get in any policy. We do have to take some regional exceptions. I don't know if some of you may or may not know what that is, but more importantly, we always still require the 125% extended coverage. And what that means is that we don't want the coverage for just the principal of our investment. That's not enough for us. we know that there's going to be a cost associated with getting that claim back. We know that there's going to be more than just the principal. It's impossible to have it. They don't pay day one. It doesn't work that way. So we want to have the coverage to cover all the costs. So that's why we get that 125, and that's part of the best practices that we've developed from all the prior loans that we've had previously. So I'll talk about this real quick. So the political landscape right now is that we heard that the Sessions rescinded the Cole memo. What the Cole memo was the Department of Justice, a guy with last name Cole, he wrote the 8 items for compliance that said, if you are operating within these 8 items, then we're essentially saying that we're not going to go out and prosecute you. So that Cole memo was rescinded, but it still doesn't wipe out the fact that the Rohrabacher Farm Amendment has taken away all their funding for prosecuting for medical licensing. So technically, there is some exposure right now for recreational or adult use cannabis operators out there, and that's up to those people how they want to operate there, and we don't know where that may go. I'm hopeful that Dana will share something that is some good information that will kind of dovetail into that later, and if not, I'll share what that is. The other thing is that Dana told me this personally, that the Trump administration has recently changed their position, that they are not necessarily saying that they're pro-cannabis, but they're going to maintain that the states' rights, and that they're going to have that's the priority. If the state has approved it, that's what they're going to go with. And that kind of came from Cory Booker, I think in Colorado. He was leveraging the federal judges not being appointed, and that was the deal that they worked out. So will that apply to how long will that policy remain in place? We don't know. It could change tomorrow. But the Rohrabacher Farm Amendment is still there, and that's what we know can't change because it's already an amendment that's been signed. So I talked a little bit about the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer Amendment, and that we're hopeful, and we're being told that that's going to make it into the omnibus spending bill. And the reason that that's important is that a standalone amendment is a lot easier to be attacked for a congressman's vote if they voted on something than it is for them to vote for an omnibus spending bill that has hundreds and thousands of things in the bill. So that's why once it's in that omnibus, it doesn't come out, and we feel that we've finally got a permanent safe harbor there. And the other thing is, I don't know if any of you saw, but Speaker Boehner joined a cannabis fund, I think just 2 weeks ago. In fact, Todd Russman here shared that with me as the day that it happened. We were having lunch, and I wasn't aware of it. But the tide is turning for some of these top people, and even conservatives in Washington D.C. And it looks like the tide is changing for family offices and other investment groups are going into the space. When we started 2 years ago, there really wasn't a whole lot of activity there. We were attending conferences and things like that, and everybody was just interested. But at some point in the last 2 years, most of them now have gone into doing some type of equity investment. And my best guess is the only reason I can imagine that they went into equity is because there was no debt out there that they knew of to go to get debt, or they probably would have gone in that area. And we've got some solutions to talk about later about that as well. Okay, so why don't I have our panel come up and come on up, and we'll have a brief discussion, and we'll maybe open it up to Q&A. So, just anywhere would be fine. So this is Dennis Baranowski, Peter Wingham, and Dave Schumacher. And
protecting my dessert.
This is it. And what I wanted to do is, we've got such a great panel of people here that I can kind of drive a couple of questions to you as kind of some to start the dialogue. But what I'd like to do is just kind of open it up from there, because I know that that's more what you guys want your questions answered more than what ours. So one of the questions that we always get asked is, Dennis, is that what if the property is seized by the Department of Justice? Have you seen that? What happens to the lender's interest in that scenario?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure that you're clear on what properties are actually getting seized. Seizures in California, probably in the last, I'd say 3 years, have been limited to properties where it's been a bad actor. When I say bad actor, I mean unlicensed individuals. Recently, there have been a bunch of seizures on single-family residences that was tied to the Chinese mafia. But obviously, they weren't licensed, and so they operated a bunch of grow houses, and so those properties were seized. We have not had an occasion, like I said, in the last 3 years, where one of our clients that had made a loan to a licensed cannabis operator had their property seized. So I think that right there is a little bit of an important distinction. Doesn't mean that it hasn't happened, but based on our experience, and as well as other attorneys that I've spoken with and people in the industry, it definitely is not something that's been prevalent in the last couple of years. With respect to the bad actor seizures, we've been able to recover our client, on behalf of our client lenders, we've been able to recover all the funds on their loans for them. So initially the federal government comes in and says, oh, well, we're not going to give you anything back. And then within a matter of a week, a couple phone conversations, they become more cooperative. They see that our clients are not part of the Chinese mafia and participating in this illegal activity. And so they've worked with us in order to allow them to get their investment back. So,
Great, thank you. And Dave, does that ever affect the title on the property for you if there was a seizure?
Well, we've insured drug forfeiture, U.S. Department seizures. Usually the lenders are, there's a period of time where you guys aren't getting paid, but then eventually you do. And they usually will settle with the lenders. That's what we've seen as far as title. And also, a lot of times we'll see forfeiture judgments. They haven't really seized the property, but there's this $25 million judgment that's tied up to the property. And we've been able to get those released. Because you can't do anything without the Department of Justice's permission. So we'll get waivers from the Department of Justice that says that, yeah, Dave, we're not going after the property, and here's a release. So usually you have to contact the attorney that's listed on the forfeiture judgments. And then usually they'll cooperate, and or if they want a piece of the pie, they'll negotiate usually with the lenders and settle.
You can't bond around that?
No. Well, there's a bonding company that will.
All right. Okay. So Sid, can you tell us what's different when you appraise a cannabis property as opposed to a regular commercial property? What are the things that you're looking at?
Well, there's no difference. It's still a piece of real estate. So we're looking at it from a valuation standpoint on real estate. There's still 3 major approaches: cost, income, and sales comparison. The difference when looking at cannabis properties is ensuring that you have a correct data set to rely on. One of the biggest challenges in any real estate transaction is finding accurate lease data. So cannabis properties even more so, because prior to recently, a lot of these things were done in the shadows and done behind the scenes. So that's the biggest challenge. I've been doing it for 20 years, cannabis properties, and I have a pretty good data set now that I've amassed.
Good. And Peter, when you do the review of entitlements and zoning and permits for the property, can you tell us what's different for you when you put together your report for us with respect to cannabis-related properties?
So I think the only difference is, again, Sid was saying, it's a property, et cetera, and I've done those kind of reports for 15 years for pretty much every national fast food, pharmacy, what have you, chain, et cetera, and there it's just, what does the zoning call for, what are the vagaries, what are the permits that are required, et cetera. CUP for a drive-through, now CUP for a licensed operation, what have you, et cetera. The only challenge, or the only difference, I guess, is the newness of it here, especially in California. company that I'm aware of that has 6 facilities in Colorado, one in Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, came here. They actually were one of the first 2 or 3 permitted at the state level, found a facility in Linwood, and were ready to get up and running. They still aren't, because all of a sudden now, as the LA County looks through this, they say, oh, no, what? We've got the fire department in the Coupa that is now an issue. And you've got your utilities, all of these things are new, and the jurisdictions are just now figuring out how they want to approach this. So it's important to, as early as possible, understand not just what the city stated process is, but what are the other things that they don't even know at this point in time that are going to need to be addressed before you can actually start operating.
That brings up, we had a transaction in Desert Hot Springs where we ran into that the city had approved cannabis, but it fell in the jurisdiction of the county for the fire department. And to get the fire suppression numbers from an unfriendly county was rather difficult. And so we are learning that there are some hurdles in getting through some of those things, just like we talked about. Dennis, in general, do the permits for CUPs transfer with the property?
So, for the most part, they do.
Through foreclosure.
Often they do, as long as it's documented correctly. But that is a question that kind of varies by municipality. So it's important from the standpoint at the beginning of the underwriting process that the parties that are performing the underwriting are looking at and understanding exactly what the transferability of that CUP would be. But for the most part, we found that it's in reviewing the ordinances, we've found that it's been transferred through foreclosure.
And just in general, each one of these borrowers and entities that owns the property has different structures, and we give that big pile to Dennis and we say, figure out, we want to make sure that we've got not only this license tied up, but that we need to make sure that they can't be transferred to another entity or we lose those, because that's part of our value to the property. So, and each one's different, and we have all kinds of different solutions for different types of entities. So for each one. We're going to be, hopefully we'll get a call here any minute from Dana, but, oh, there's Jason, awesome. I know. Jason, do you have anything to add while we wait on the political landscape? So Jason is Rohrabacher's Director of Finance, and I'm just curious if you have anything that you want to add on the political landscape while we wait for Dana to call in.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting time. Great to see everybody here. There's so much interest in this space. You've been great on this whole issue, and yeah, I think he's supposed to be calling your call, but we want to hear from him about the new legislation that solves the problem.
Yeah.
As I didn't see the beginning of the presentation, but most of the states now are on this page, and it's just the federal government that we need to move. So.
I think it was 44 states. Last time I counted, have either medically approved or recreational currently, and only I think 5 or 6 hadn't had none of them, which I think that was somewhere in there. So yeah, it seems to be going that way. Let me see if I've got.
There's 4 states now without.
4?
Idaho, and then straight down.
Yeah.
South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas.
Good.
There's a question over here.
Okay.
Can you have maybe Dave can speak a little bit. He had mentioned something about cooperating with the DOJ. When they take the property and they're working out a solution with the lender, are they only focused on? We're obviously looking to get the debt piece back. You said that they'll work out a solution potentially on the equity piece to share that. Is that something that you've seen firsthand, where the equity was split with the DOJ and the lender?
No, it was more of it was behind the scenes talks between you and the DOJ, coming up with what you guys will take or not take. It's not like, okay, we're gonna sell the property. If you get 50% and DOJ gets 50. I've not seen that. It's mainly most of the time you guys have made whole, but don't hold me to that. I mean, there's not that many transactions that we deal with, like where you see a lot of seizures. But the few that we have done, we just did one in San Diego, $4 million transaction. The DOJ there was a judgment against the person's name, and that attaches to all their property. And so we just wanted to make sure that they're not going to we just get their permission. You're not going to do you intend to seize this property in the future or not? And they said no, and they gave me something in writing.
So they give you a forfeiture release on that particular scenario?
Yeah, it doesn't make the debt go away,
Right.
but at least we can sell the property without having to deal with the judgment.
So in that scenario, Dennis, maybe you could talk a little bit about your own experience in that when they cooperate, there's no resistance to getting the debt piece resolved, right?
Correct. And I'm just going to give a little bit of a caveat on that. We have a litigation department in our firm that handles the majority of that, so I work with them as far as what happens and where it goes, but a lot of the day-to-day and how they get to that point, I'm not the expert in my firm. So just to give you a caveat on that. But what we found, though, is with respect to getting those seizures back and the recovery for our clients, they've been able to recover all the principal that they've lent, as well as, certain instances, interest, but not default interest. So,
Hello,
bigger
is
names.
this Dana?
Hi, this is Justin in Mr. Rohrbacher's office. Is this Rob?
Yes, it is.
Hold on just a second. I'm going to patch you through.
Okay, great.
Hey, Rob, this is Dana.
Hey Dana, you're on speakerphone with our group here at the Pacific Club. I'm sure you've been here many times, and we'd just like to hear a few words from you. And I've got 3 questions that I emailed you earlier, but maybe you can just start by saying hello.
Well, let me just note that I got in last night. I took the red eye in last night, and so I'm just emerging from this haze that you get when you don't get any sleep from the night before. You'll have to ask me the questions.
No problem.
That you said.
Oh, no problem. So, when we talked the other day, what's still needed to get the Rohrbacher-Blumenauer amendment into the omnibus bill? Can you just explain the process that needs to happen for us so that we as laymen can understand that?
Well, there's 2 ways you get an amendment into an omnibus bill. That's if you amended the original. An omnibus bill, by the way, just so you'll know, is just a group of bills that were put together in one vote. And then for one vote. Now, the things that are put into that bill are via votes on the floor. I've done that on several occasions in the past with the Rohrbacher farm bill, but in this case, I was denied that right for the appropriations, basically the Justice Department appropriations bill. We had some very tough characters here making some power plays, but when I didn't get the vote on the floor, I was sort of given a promise, personal promise. We will be working with you to see that it gets in the bill as the process goes through reconciliation with the Senate. And that's basically what happened this time, is the bill that went from the House, and then I went over and spoke to some members in the Senate, and some Republicans in the Senate as well. And I had some help from some folks here on the Republican side, and they agreed that they would propose, that they would propose that the House would accept the Senate version, which includes the Rohrbacher-Barr language. And so we kept it a very low key so that could be done without stirring up the opposition. And sure enough, we were able to get all the players, and this is all happening behind the scenes, so a lot of, sometimes people won't keep their word, etc., but in this case, everybody did, and now it's been placed into the omnibus bill, which means from now until next October, or this coming October, that is, we have Rohrbacher-Barr protections against anybody in the Department of Justice using any of their resources in the Department of Justice in a way that supersedes state law in those laws where medical cannabis is legal. I now am planning, of course, to try to put the Rohrbacher-Barr language into the next appropriations bill for the Department of Justice, but for all government agencies and all government departments, that they should, that they will handle themselves, like whether it's the Department of Treasury, regulating banking, etc. All of them shall be exercising their authority in being consistent with that state's medical marijuana, or in this case, any marijuana laws that that state has passed. So that's the bill. Number one, getting it back in as an insurance policy, just for our bar, but having the standalone bill, which is what I'm proposing. If we get that passed, we have then solved this issue and don't have to go back every year and put it in the, into an appropriations bill.
So
And it also handles a lot of the issues rather than just the DEA and the Department of Justice.
wow, that's great. Is that standalone, is that you're kind of deconflicting all the rest of the agencies. Is that standalone bill require a vote every year?
No. If we pass a standalone bill, now there are other people who have amendments for specific departments. For example, there's some bills that are being presented now by people just for banking, for example, and that's a bill that would instruct the Department of Treasury to act in a way with marijuana consistent with the state laws. But I think that I will support those amendments that they can then put on the bill, on those bills on the floor. I will support each one of them individually, but I don't want that to take away from our effort to actually do an overall bill that will be put in place of these type of regular freedom from this type of government overreach without, and then we won't have to redo it every year. It actually it'll stay law until it's undone.
Great. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And just one last question. Can you tell us how the Trump administration has recently changed their position and how you feel things are going there as far as today?
Yeah, sure. We should all be rejoicing that there are signs that the opposition to permitting the states to devise their own cannabis laws and regulations, the defense is crumbling, and we have now, Boehner is on our side. That's a big jump forward, because Boehner is very well respected among the Republican elite, and those of us regular Republicans like him too. And then there's the president coming out like this. The president has, during the election, made his commitment to letting the states determine whether or not adult recreational marijuana should be legal. That should be up to the states. He even said that medical marijuana should be legal just right off the bat. And so he said that several times during the last election. I have not been able to get to him and to confront him with that. And that's because of some complications dealing with what is an absolute travesty, which is this ongoing investigation trying to say that he colluded with the Russians to steal the election. But that because there's a special prosecutor now involved in that, they didn't want me talking to the president, because the special prosecutor would say, this is an excuse to dramatically expand his investigation. And then they can start looking into us for everything. It's like they're looking into the president's lawyer now about some payoff that the president may have made to deal with a blackmail effort by some porno queen that he had married. What does that have to do with the Russians? So anyway, they haven't let me get to the president to talk to him specifically for that reason. They don't want the special prosecutor. Well, because of that, I haven't been able to basically do what our friend over in the Senate just did in the conversation with him. Our senator from Colorado, he was holding up the president's appointees. The president called him up, and Senator Gardner said to him, look, if you want me to take off my hold on your employees, we need you to fulfill your campaign pledge to permit the states to respect the state's laws on marijuana. And the president said that's going to be my policy from now on. And the guy lifted his hold on the president's appointment. That is a huge step forward, as the president say. It's huge. That gives me and the advocates here a real chance to possibly pass this bill in the next 6 months. And I would hope everybody in the country gets behind it and sees their member of Congress, sees their senators, especially we want to chart out which Republicans are standing in the way and have everybody focus on those Republicans. We don't need to waste our time enlisting people who are already in the fight with us. But we need, for example, even in Orange County, I didn't have any of the other 3 members of Congress in Orange County voting for my amendment. The Robert Farman that never got Ed Royce or Phoebe Walters or Eliza behind us. Well, we need to focus on whoever those members of Congress are. And I think that Sean Nelson, for example, is, I believe, backing me up in this. And we need to make sure that nationwide we go to the senators who we can bring over on this. And I know that Feinstein actually has been not helpful in this whole fight. But the fact is we can get a senator at the Democratic side that will side with us on this. So those are the issues at hand.
All right, we'll talk to Royce and Waters about getting on board with this. That's ridiculous. We'll get the Gen Next PAC, putting some pressure on them. Well, thank you. We really appreciate, and there's a crowd of probably about 40 people here, Dana, and we'll make sure that everybody knows to support you for your next election coming up here, and we wish you the best.
I sure appreciate that, but that it's not necessary because everybody should do what they think is right. And I'm doing, the only reason I took this cannabis issue up is I know there are people suffering who could be helped by medical use, but also I think it's a total waste of our resources, limited law enforcement resources, both with the courts, with police time, with putting people in jail, and to drain that away, to try to prevent adults from smoking a weed in their backyard is a ridiculous waste of resources when we have criminals to deal with, and also we certainly don't want to keep financing the Mexican drug cartel, who are the ones who are the beneficiaries of having cannabis remain illegal.
Right. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Right.
Have a good day.
All right.
We'll follow up with you later.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Jason, for putting that together. We really appreciate it. We've got such a direct contact way to reach out through Jason. And Jason not only supports Dana, but a couple of other people, Rand Paul, and
Any pro-freedom people get behind.
Right, okay. So I'd like to open it up to questions. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, it's actually pretty good timing. So I've seen some cannabis opportunities over the last 2 or 3 years, and they always tout outside, rents and returns and so on and so forth. But a lot of that's because ostensibly you're getting a premium due to all the difficulty it is to deal with this asset class, banking, restrictions and all that sort of stuff. And so the obvious question is, if you buy something based upon these premium rents and it's all normalized, those rents would theoretically come back down. So Sid, what does that do to the value of the property if your rents have been artificially high for these many years?
Well, when rents drop, the NOI drops and values drop, but.
Right, so when you're evaluating though, are you evaluating it based upon a substitute use, alternative use, or as the highest and best use, even though it has those potentially, artificially premium rents?
It depends on the needs of the client. When I attack a property, the first question I have to ask is, what's the problem to be solved? So if it's for this type of a transaction, if Dan or Robert would call me up and say, we've got this property, for you to look at, it's a cannabis property, then I put myself in, not Rob and Dan's shoes, but in your shoes, the investor shoes. And because most investors aren't in the cannabis business, or they're not in the barber shop business, they're in the loan business, right? So you need to know if you're gonna be able to get rid of your asset. So I look at it from that perspective. I can't ignore the fact that it's a cannabis property because it's in a legally zoned cannabis area and the market is attracted to that right now. What I can do for, as Dan and Rob asked, is that they want to see a value as a cannabis property, and then they want to see a value as if irrespective of cannabis. Now that's going to be a hypothetical value because the fact remains that it is in a cannabis zone and the market's attracted to that property. Currently, most of the private loans that these guys are dealing with are 2-year notes. And currently the supply is so restricted, the legal supply is so restricted that it's not even an issue. There's not going to be an oversupply in 2 years. There's just the county governments, the city governments are moving too slowly permitting these facilities. You can't even apply for a state license until you're either applied for or have received a county or municipality license. I think there are only 138 state licenses that have been granted to date. So this industry is so young and so much in its infancy, I'm not really concerned about rents compressing in the near term. Over the long term, of course, any asset class, when supply and demand starts to balance out, you're going to see
That use is protected irrespective of the federal action that might happen, is what you're saying.
Yes,
Okay.
but I do account for the federal, it's a slim possibility growing slimmer, but that's accounted for in the cap rate. And we're seeing these properties trading, anywhere from 12 to 15 to 18%, where these asset classes would normally be trading at 5% or 6%.
I'd like to share, so we take that appraisal, but we have protections. Our loans are typically 1 to 2 years, and we can choose to not extend that loan. If we see that the market's starting to compress, we simply won't extend, and we're going to force them to pay us off. So we have protections from our side as the lender. And not only though, when he gives us the value, we still are going to determine what the LTV is going to be on that. Are we going to go to 50% on this or 60% on this? How strong is the asset? Where is that property located? Is it downtown Los Angeles or is it in Adelanto?
So along the same lines, Rob, then when you're looking at your loan to value advance, so you're taking what Sid's saying as far as what that property could be worth, obviously a lot less if it had to go into the market. So how do you do, is there any statistics on loan to value on a non-cannabis use rental rate?
So that's what they were, that's what they're, what most markets will have what those rents were for that. So we're getting those values so we know what that range is, and that's going to affect that in combination with how strong the sponsor is and what the area is. That's going to affect what we're going to lend to on the LTV. So we're going to adjust the risk by adjusting that LTV. And that's going to be anywhere from 50 to 60%. Dan?
So one of the other things we do as well, it's a great question. Strength of sponsors is incredibly important, but we also look at skin in the game. We want to make sure that our sponsors have a deep cash position in their projects, and most of them do. As Rob touched on earlier, most of these sponsors are high net worth individuals with separate income streams. They're not specific to just income to the cannabis facility. They have their own jobs. People are very professional in nature. So we spend a lot of time looking at what they've got into it. We're looking at a transaction now, for instance, it's a $4 million transaction, and they've already put $2.3 million in infrastructure into that space, in addition to what they paid cash for the property. So those are things that we factor in addition to looking at the value side of it as well.
Is there another question I can take? You had a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
Or we already answered them all?
No. Dennis,
Yes, sir.
where's the investor risk?
Where is the investor risk?
Yeah.
So it's going to depend on, you're looking at both, obviously from a financial side, and then you would say it's what I would consider more of a hypothetical criminal risk, but not from the standpoint of dealing with medical marijuana facilities. So if you were investing in a loan or investing in a property and you're directly tied into that investment and they were dealing with recreational use, if you're involved, and the more involved you're into the operation, the more touches you have within that, the more hypothetically the federal government would come in and could say, look, you're involved in this criminal enterprise. You know, that's the scary side of it. Again, realistically, as far as application and what we've seen, that hasn't happened. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen or couldn't happen, no. And that's why we typically, when we advise our clients, if they're going to invest in cannabis, if they're going to make loans to cannabis businesses, stick to the safer side and deal with medicinal, where there's additional protections that are provided to them. And so it's just going to depend on which product that you're dealing with. You know, obviously from an investment risk standpoint, again, I think we've already talked about it with respect to, you know, getting the appraisals, looking at the rent value, depending on what your risk tolerance is. Again, personally, for me, when I advise especially new clients, tell them, look, you need to look at your exit strategy. How are you going to get out of this loan if it doesn't perform? Or how are you going to get out of the loan if it matures? Are you going to look at the value of the property based on the cannabis use? I typically tell them no. You look at it at what the actual exit's going to be for the non-cannabis use. So, yeah, there's risk, but in any investment, you're looking at risk. So again, from the monetary side, it's like any investment that you're dealing with, and it's based on your risk tolerance and what you're willing to put your money into. From a potential, again, criminal side, the more invested you are, coming in on an equity side is going to be much more risky than making a loan. We also have a lot of situations where our clients will be making loans to a property owner who in turn is then leasing to a licensee, which again provides an additional layer of separation between the lender and the actual operator and the license. So I guess the bottom line is medical marijuana, much less of a risk on that side of it. Make sure you underwrite it properly and value it and make it a tone or conform to your risk tolerance. And you know, for the time being, I would probably steer clear of recreational use, especially if you're looking to invest directly in equity. If you're looking at, that's my attorney answer. If you're looking at it from my personal answer, if the right opportunity came along for equity and recreational, I would probably do it. But that's me personally. That's not me as an attorney. So you know, it's because I really don't. To me, I don't see. I see the tide swinging in the direction of where you're not looking at the risk of federal enforcement. I don't think it's in the interest of anybody to push in that direction. And you know, and again, this is my own opinion and where I'm looking at it. But I think that's a fight that the Department of Justice doesn't want. Coming into California, where one of the richest states in the U.S., we already have people that are putting money, attorneys behind it. If you have the federal government coming in and prosecuting illegal activity in the state of California that's generating hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially billions of dollars for the state in tax revenue, do you really think the state's not going to fight back? So again, that's my opinion. That's not the legal advice I give, but that's my impression of the landscape, and that's why, again, if I had the right opportunity, I would invest equity into a recreational, because I don't think it's ever going to come to the point where you're going to get prosecuted federally. So.
That's interesting about the state. Yes.
Rob, obviously there's a risk in everything. The more you spread your money out into more loans, the better. Do you offer this where you're buying a basket of loans, or are your investors investing loan by loan?
So we have both strategies. Over the last 2 years, we've done one-off transactions as multi-beneficiaries, multiple investors on it. And we also now are the first debt fund that we know of going into the cannabis space. And in the debt fund, you'll have a collective, you'll have a membership in all of the loans that the entire the fund covers. So we do have that, and that's something that we're launching this month. So that's an emerging fund. Our previous securities offering, we did $91 million, and I think our average yield was 10.92, I believe. And we're targeting 11% for this particular fund. And we're happy to send you guys more information on that if anybody is interested. On both. Some people prefer to do individual transactions, but the fund is the better structure. You get more benefits as an investor the way that we structured it. We're happy to talk about that afterwards if you'd like. Anybody else have some other questions? We've got some people that could answer some great questions here. Yes.
Rob, based on Dennis's description of some of the risks,
Mm-hmm.
we've been in real estate for 40 years.
Okay.
We really have never come across elements of Department of Justice, criminal, Fed, regs. And now that we look at embracing these things, we're looking at the yield and saying, for a 10 or 11% yield, why are we taking on these risks?
Sure.
When we didn't have to and don't have to at the time. And the second part of the question is, for the investors that are looking for yield, would you bifurcate the first mortgage and maybe lower that amount and then set up a mezz piece where there's a higher yield to it to maybe attract the investors that will say, okay, Department of Justice, and they get closed down and
So the first part is that on the yield at our target of being 11%, we have done a conservative estimate on what our target is going to be for that yield. We believe that it'll creep up higher than that, but remember, our yield is a secured first lien position in debt. It's not any participation in equity. And most of the yields that you've seen in this space, because we're not aware of very many, there's only about 4 lenders that we know that are offering any debt in the space that we're aware of. And we're in the ballpark of that. It ranges anywhere from 9 to 12 is what we're seeing out there. So there might be one-off transactions. A family office might do their own, and maybe they've got some crazy rate, and they may have gone to a higher loan to value or taken some other concessions. I can't speak to them, but for us, we're targeting around 11% on those transactions. We believe that that'll slowly over time go higher than that because we're sharing our origination, a portion of origination, and we're also sharing a portion of our extension fees every time we extend the loan with our investors. But to answer that specific question, I can't speak to what the return was on where you're getting that information to compare apples to apples. So it's not fair to me to, it could be a guy that went to 75% value and you're comparing that with it. So I don't know what that was. And then to the second part of your question, would we consider doing a bifurcating or 2 asset classes within our share? Interestingly enough, in our previous offering of the 91 million, we had different asset classes, and we did offer that. We have the ability to do something like that, but it would be done in a different way, potentially. If we had an investor that had a substantial amount of capital, we may look at starting a different fund that incorporates those types of bifurcated asset classes. But the structure of the fund right now is it's everybody's in the same spot, everybody gets the same position, everybody's treated equally. We've seen some situations when there's a junior asset class where the disparity of the hit was not proportional to the amount of yield that they made, and so we're trying to avoid that particular situation in the future. So it's best from doing thousands of loans. That's kind of where we've ended up on this. If there's a need, or if we wanted to do that, there's other ways of structuring it. We could reduce our loan from the fund on the first, and we could put you in a second position as a mezz piece. We could facilitate that. We're happy to educate and work with other family offices. You may want to be the sole beneficiary of your own particular transaction. We're happy to be the broker of record and line everything up on that and work with you guys for that. Those are some of the things that we can potentially do for clients. So I hope I answered your question. So in some ways there.
And Rob, excuse me, maybe for comparison's sake, what's the standard yield on a non-cannabis deal? Let's take, for instance, on a construction deal or whatever.
For apples to apples, for commercial transactions for the same property, you're looking at like 7 to 9%, and that's at 75%, loan to value. So we're at 50 to 60% loan to value at 11% yield with the same property. and significantly, most likely significantly better sponsors. But again, I don't know for the cannabis transaction you're speaking to. I lost a deal the other day that was for 9%, and the guy went to like 75%. But what he didn't tell me until after I unpacked the conversation is that he took a first trustee on the property, but he also lent him another $5 million and was taking ownership. And so it was a package of debt. So I can't compare apples to apples without knowing the whole project, without knowing the whole transaction. But any of you that are here, anybody that's interested in investing in a transaction, we're here to help educate you, whether we're involved in the transaction or not. You can reach out to any of us and you can ask us, do you think you've got these things covered? We're happy to share with you what our take are on that, whether you're working with us or not. We believe that to get this industry to be more compliant and to be more mainstream and to become something that can be federally legalized, that we have to establish best practices for all lenders. And so that's why we're openly talking about it here.
Aren't you investing in their distribution system?
When you say, aren't we investing in there, we're not investing in anything. We're only providing debt to a borrower. So we're not investing. Our investors invest in our fund or in our company. We are strictly, think of us as a bank. Does a bank invest in a business? They invest in the relationship, but not in the profit. They don't have any profits or losses from that business, other than if they foreclosed and they didn't get their full principal back. So we have no ownership interest whatsoever in any of these companies. We're specifically set up that way.
He brings up an interesting question, though, about distribution. And because now we're finding out there's many forms of licenses. There's distribution, manufacture, cultivation, retail sales.
Sure.
Have you seen anybody, or can you use the license as collateral, as some form of collateral?
Sure. So I just recently spoke with the California Bureau of Cannabis, trying to get an update on everything they're doing. So every business that does cannabis related business, CRB is what the acronym is issued a license by the California Bureau of Cannabis. And that license will have a classification, edibles or cultivation, large scale, indoor, whatever it may be. My question to them was, is this license for that business would be to our tenant or operator, is that transferable? They said that it's not transferable, and if you take any position in that entity, even if it's only $1, you have to redisclose. So what we were thinking is that, look, we'll just have that the entity that is the operator that has the license, we'll just transfer the shares to us if in the event that the chance of the shares of that entity in the event of the default. These are some of the things that we work through sometimes to wrap up that collateral, put a position on the board so they can't vote without having us involved. But in that particular circumstance, it sounds like it's not going to be a place that we can go. However, what we would do is that the property still is in a zoned area that is for cannabis, and it still has a condition, it still has to have, the property has to be zoned as well, and the business. So in worst case scenario, we would simply foreclose, take title to the property, and we would lease it or sell it to another operator that already has a business, already has a cannabis license business. So we would stay away from that. So I don't know if I answered that for you specifically, but I'm trying to get to the answer for you.
I'm trying to look at the risk and trying to lower the risk. You're saying if there's a default, you take over the property.
That's correct.
So why don't you buy the property and lease it back to them?
So we don't buy, in this particular example, if we foreclose on the property, it becomes ours. The conditional use permits and the zoning all stay the same, and they transfer with us. However, we end up with the property. We're not operators in the cannabis. We would take that property, and we would probably reach out to all of our existing borrowers and people that we have in operators, and in lieu of selling it on the open market with a commission, we would probably sell it to one of them. Would we look at trying to sell that, operate it ourselves? Then we're getting into the cannabis business, and right now we're trying to stay away from that as the laws are what they are. However, we do have the ability, and we do have relationships with like Peter Whittingham, where we know where there's a high potential for cannabis zoning to be being approved. And we may go and tie up leases for short term during the period in which we think it'll take for that to happen. And once that zoning changes, we can sell that lease off or that assignment, or we can tie that property up. So we do have the ability to do it, but we wouldn't do it from an operation standpoint. We would just do it to flip that property to bring in profits to the fund and get that yield above that 11%.
Dennis, if you owned the property and you did a lease to the licensee with, say, a base rent and maybe a percentage of the revenues, would you be considered an owner of that business?
If you're sharing, not necessarily an owner, but if you're sharing the revenue of the business, I think if you're looking at it, I'm assuming you're asking from a potentially criminal type
just like
no, you would be considered an owner, but you still would be considered a participation because you're still benefiting directly from the profits of that business through the agreements. It's different than saying you're going to pay me a mortgage or you're going to pay me rent. You're actually tied to the performance of the business itself, as opposed to just that money can come from anywhere.
You can take percentage rent on gross sales.
Right.
Yeah.
Retail restaurants did that for years.
Yeah, I get it, but again, you're still tying yourself to the operation of the cannabis business.
Cannabis business is different, because if you're in the cannabis business, if you're touching a flower in any way or being an owner of the flower, you're then dealing in the flower. You really, if you bifurcate and you have one entity that owns the building,
Right.
and you take a percentage of rents, that's one thing. But if you have an operator that's operating that building, then you have an issue.
Where the exposures on that is a different one than you would think of. It's that if your bank finds out that you're collecting partial interest revenue, they could end your banking relationship immediately. And that's the blowback that several people are having. And even some operators are owners of properties that are in regular institutional mortgages have leased to cannabis operators, and those notes are getting called for that same reason, because they don't want to have their federal license lost. And so that's an unintended consequence. And we've even been warned of that from advertising, that just from that alone could end our banking relationship. So we've put things in place to protect ourselves and to avoid that.
Hey, Rob, I have more of a technical question on treatment, tax treatment. Is the income considered interest income, or is it trade or business income? That does have a relevance as far as filing in California or out of state.
Sure. So for trustee investments, it's ordinary income.
I know it's ordinary income, but is it interest income or trade or business income?
Yeah, I will have Dan answer that, but I believe it's the first.
It's interest income.
Anybody else got any? These are some great questions.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. It was an awesome time. I'm glad we got Dana on the line.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to us. If you want your parking validated, right by the entrance, they'll give you a validation. We also have a whole bunch of upcoming events. Misty has a list by the front, plus with our thank you note tomorrow, we'll have registration for them. We hope to see you at our next event, May 31st at the Intercontinental Hotel. Thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye.